Colleagues, we are now at exactly 11 o'clock, which is the start of the last session. For the next hour, we will be focusing on creating an enabling environment for innovation, which is why I was making mention of productivity, seeds, agrochemicals, and everything that makes this sector to be as vibrant as it is today. We have about a panel of four people, and we will start off with an address from Dr. Boitshoko Ntshabele, who is a director of Biosecurity with the National Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development. Many of you will know him. He spent many years sitting in Europe and looking after our interests as the Republic of South Africa in that side. He will be joined on stage by Mr. Rodney, who's CEO of Croplife, Dr. Lukeshni, Chetty, CEO of SANSOR, and Ms. Mkhonza, who's a registrar for the GMO Act within the Department of Agriculture. I'm going to ask all of you to please join me on stage and Dr. Ntshabele to come give us your opening remarks, and then right after your address, we will get into the discussion.
Shall I start? Yes, please. Oh, okay. Hello there. So good morning to all of you, and thank you very much for the opportunity to address you this morning. I've opted not to do a death by PowerPoint, and rather to speak to you with regards to discussions around innovation, challenges, and regulatory responses. So, ladies and gentlemen, greetings to all of you. It is my pleasure to be here with you today, and I must start by presenting apologies from our Minister, Minister Thoko Didiza, who I am representing here today. So generally, before I make any presentations, I always start with a humor point. It's not for you, it's for me, so that I can calm down and relax. Because sometimes when you do these things, you get a bit edgy and a little bit too excited. So I hope you find this one funny. But if you don't, just laugh. And for my case. So it goes like this. So a man was driving along a freeway when he noticed a chicken running alongside his car. He was amazed to see that this chicken was keeping up with the car. So he was doing about 50 km an hour, and then this chicken was right beside his car. He increased to 60, the chicken was there. He got to 80 kilometers per hour. Then the chicken decided, no, this is too slow. And the chicken went forward. He then noticed something, that this chicken had 3 legs. So he followed the chicken down the road and ended up at the farm. When he got there, he realized that all chickens on that farm had 3 legs. So he asks the farmer, what's up with these chickens? The farmer said, well, everybody likes chicken legs. I have then bred the 3-legged bird. I am going to make a killing and become a millionaire. So then he asks him, how does it taste? Then the farmer said, I don't know. I've never managed to catch one. So there's innovation for you, that sometimes with innovation you create new problems. So on a serious note, your request was that I speak to innovation in South Africa's agriculture sector and the contribution of regulators. I have couched my talk as follows: challenges in the agri-food space, innovative interventions, and related regulatory issues. I hope that you find this approach useful. According to Clegg and others, agriculture innovation evolves as a result of interactions between different actors such as farming systems, supply chains, and economic systems, policy, environment, extension, and societal systems, which reflects the idea of agricultural innovation systems. So you can see that I'm at a point in my life where sometimes it's the glasses, sometimes it is without the glasses. So I was battling. The doctor says I must look, but I battle sometimes. So please forgive me. I'm taking them off now and doing it this way. So in South Africa, we have the 1996 white paper on science and technology, which introduced the notion of a national system of innovation. In this paper, the national system of innovation is conceptualized as a means by which a country seeks to create, acquire, diffuse, and put into practice new knowledge that will help that country and its people achieve their individual and collective goals. The development intent of the country's science and technology policies was declared in this definition of the NSI, which then set the scene for a system that would focus on creating and applying knowledge for the nation's social and economic advancement. Within agriculture, therefore, the system of innovation is made up of the collective effort and investment of all institutions and their interactions to advance agriculture in South Africa. It includes universities, private sector players, that is yourselves, state institutions who employ their resources individually and severally to advance progress in terms of seeking solutions to challenges faced by the sector. At the heart of the system is human capacity development, which is determined in the form of the level of training achieved by the sector. This, as it is people who are to design and employ related technologies arising from innovation. A key output of our agri-food innovation should thus be the numbers of postgraduate trainings at master's and doctoral level. Having set the scene, therefore, I wish to mention that there is a case also to be made to ensure that innovation in the agricultural space be made or employed to be transformational in terms of addressing disparities or the agricultural development divide in the sector. I am talking here about smallholder farming development and the growing of small-scale farmers to becoming commercial and to ensure their inclusion in the mainstream agri-food economy. In my mind, we should all work towards a totally complete package that responds to the multifactorial issues that they have to contend with if we are to grow the sector. One of the things that we probably never realize is that having a sector that is dual also creates a burden to the state, in that you almost have to have a split system in terms of how you administer policy and regulation. A typical example is if you look at our exports to the EU, they are a very classical example where you have duplicity in terms of the work that you need to do. So if you do something twice, you run the risk of not being effective in terms of how you allocate and employ resources. In a number of ways, this requires going back to basics from a solution crafting point of view. In her 2022 budget speech, Minister Didiza referred to an initiative, the Partners in Agri-Land Solutions, PALS, where there is a partnership between emerging and commercial farmers, and that this Partners in Agri-Land Solutions has shown fruits in addressing constraints faced. Government alone cannot resolve the issues faced by the smallholder farmers, and thus the call for private-public partnerships is much more relevant. I'm quite happy to realize that I'm speaking to the converted, because when Matlo presented here, I saw that and I thought, yeah. What do you say in Afrikaans? Bakgat? I thought, yes, we have it right. So I'm speaking to the converted. It is in the master plan, the requirement that we ensure that we have and build private-public partnerships. I think we need to also reflect that we have been talking for a number of years about the challenges faced by smallholder farmers and their development to become commercial. It reflects both on the state and yourselves, or us, or the private sector, or business, or banks, whoever. So it cannot be that as government we're failing to create an enabling environment. I think it's all of us. So please reflect on that and perhaps consider how we can partner better to ensure that we grow this sector. The opportunities have been mentioned here today in terms of what agri-food sector can benefit from, can deliver intra-Africa trade, exports to the East. But of course, there are challenges. I saw some of the challenges, Act 36, reform, et cetera, et cetera. So let's sit around the table and discuss all those issues, find each other, and find solutions that would work to grow the sector. So my talk thus addresses the interplays and how innovations have emerged or are emerging resulting from the interplays, as well as the regulatory responses thereto. So I start with climate change and sustainable food production. Extreme weather situations, floods and droughts have been associated with climate change. We in South Africa have recently experienced flooding in KZN and in the Eastern Cape with damage to homes, crops, including feed and related livelihoods. We also, as South Africa, suffered a severe drought in 2017. Responses have included the development of drought-resistant and drought-tolerant crops. Here we reference the ARC-led WIMA project, as well as development of fertilizer-friendly varieties which are geared to less fertilizer usage. Other interventions are targeted at less water usage, water-saving technologies and irrigation systems, for example, drip and micro-irrigation systems. We also see a push against red meat consumptions due to the emissions challenge. I'm one of those who are losing because I used to say that I like my steak big. The cow has eaten the vegetables for me, so when I eat my steak, it already has vegetables in it. So I now have to change. Work is also undertaken to develop dietary supplements and feed alternatives to assess whether they can reduce methane emissions from livestock. Supplements being considered include oils, fats, tannins, probiotics, nitrates, enzymes. Also under considerations are animal breeding techniques for reduced methanogenesis or methane production, coupled with breeding for improved feed conversion efficiency. This should be compatible and will likely reduce methane emissions and the greenhouse gas intensity of related animal products. Climate-smart agriculture and agroecological agriculture. As DAF, or now DALRRD, we worked on developing a comprehensive approach to agroecological agriculture. There is now the notion of circular agriculture, and which, according to Jegalovic and others, aims to reduce resource consumption and emissions to the environment by closing the loop of materials and substances. Under this paradigm, losses of material and substances should be prevented and otherwise be recovered for reuse, remanufacturing, and recycling. In line with these principles, moving towards a circular food system implies searching for practices and technology that minimize the input of finite resources encourage the use of regenerative ones, prevent the leakage of natural resources from the food system, and stimulate the reuse and recycling. New breeding technologies. These are a number of methods that could increase and accelerate the development of new traits. So I saw that also on the screen while sitting there. So I'm going to ask that I anticipate that a potential discussion with regards to NBTs. And the reason is that we have, as a department, received an appeal which has been tabled before the minister, and it is my view that it is not going to assist us as DALRRD, nor the appellant, to ventilate the merits of the matter here. I thus plead that we allow the process to unfold to its logical conclusion. The expansion of human settlements and resultant closer interaction between humans and animals leads to zoonosis. It leads to emerging and re-emerging diseases. And thus the notion of One Health, which is a multi-sectorial approach to zoonotic conditions. One Health is an approach in which multiple sectors work together to achieve better public health outcomes, according to the WHO. It is rooted in the recognition that human health and animal health are interdependent and bound to the health of the ecosystems in which they exist. Consumer awareness and demand. This is driven by consumers seeking to know what is in their foods, its origin, nutritional aspects. The need for traceability in response to food safety emergencies. For example, the horse meat scandal in South Africa, we had our own version, the donkey meat scandal. There was also the bigger scandal of melamine. I don't know if people still remember it. This require and assist us to be able to find out where the product originated from in order to ensure that it can be timeously removed from the food system. Consumers also demand less use of pesticides and fertilizers, and to that extent, we have seen the installation of what is referred to in other quarters as a plant doctor. This is where people use SMS technology or WhatsApp, where they take pictures of a plant, the leaf, or whatever part that is showing disease. SMS, WhatsApp, and somebody give a diagnosis, and therefore targeted application of pesticides is thus approved. We are also seeing the emergence of biopesticides, which are much more safer than conventional pesticides. The issue of private labels and private standards. These are retail sector requirements for shelf space. In many respects, they have stricter requirements for food safety, which are made by third parties beyond the standards of the OIE, Codex, and the IPP. There's also a big drive towards organic production. Organic production continues to grow in the developed markets, where it is reaching maturity. We are not seeing a significant growth in South Africa. Medical conditions as drivers of innovation. Nowadays, you go into stores, you found that you are able to find lactose-free milk, or you find milk made from nuts, but you also find gluten-free food products. Food sovereignty as a driver of innovation. Consumers choosing food from their local sources. The expansion of food types and sources. We're seeing the consumption of insects and other indigenous food. In South America, for instance, we saw the development of quinoa to the level of a staple food. This has led to Codex work to develop standards for quinoa, and this development has allowed it access beyond South America. We also see insects as food, but also insects as animal feed. Worms are used as protein source alternatives in preference to the use of fish meal. Of course, this raises food safety and feed safety issues. Innovation is also driven by regulatory pressures. In South Africa, it has been mainly in our response to EU regulations. I saw the point also here from the horticulture session. And this is largely driven by increased regulatory requirements from the EU, the Green Deal, the Farm to Fork strategy, which are geared towards their transformation of the rural landscape in Europe, and the CAP reform, as they call it, the Common Agriculture Policy Reform. They also demand less use of endocrine disruptors, as well as meat that is free of growth promoters. We have, as DALRRD, launched on the 9th of May 2022, e-certification as a tool that assists with trade facilitation, and that should see the reduced burden in terms of border inspection of South African fresh produce exported to the EU. There's also innovation from funding point of view. For example, with climate change, there's a lot of funding instruments that are geared to support agriculture. In South Africa, we saw PESI, the President Employment Stimulus, in response to COVID-19 to supply employment in the agriculture sector. There's also crowdfunding, there's Stokvels, there's also other climate smart or climate change instruments that are developed by players like the World Bank, as well as crop insurance related to similar events. We also see the use of drones and robots. We see artificial intelligence and machine learnings. There's also the issue of big data and analytics. Vast amounts of data are in disparate systems and technologies with a challenge of consolidation into central storage, and the processing of such data could assist in timely way to drive effective and timely decision-making. Of course, this could then be used to reduce pesticides use as well as targeted fertilizer delivery. In terms of regulatory issues, from a framework point of view, okay, this thing keeps coming back and it's bugging me. From a framework point of view, DALRRD and stakeholders like yourselves are in constant consultations. And in my view, this ordinarily should make for an efficient and robust regulatory systems. We have a number of consultative forums and platforms where regular interaction takes place amongst industry stakeholders. This includes the value chain roundtables, which I saw there, exporters forum, livestock industry forums, and initiatives around master plans, poultry master plans, agro-processing master plans. And the question does arise, do we really make effective usage of these forums in terms of how you impact the regulatory process in the department? Do we make full use in terms of proposing amendments to regulations? I think this is based on the basis that there are always unintended consequences in regulations. And therefore, the reform of legislation itself can originate from stakeholders as much as it can originate from government itself. In my assessment, we remain with a mixed bag in terms of outcomes. And this is based on judgment of comments and pronouncements made in the general media. Key concerns have been with over-regulation or excessive regulations, complaints around red tape, and the state has responded. I'm sure you noted in the President's address that a position has been created in the Presidency for someone to look at red tape in government. However, this should not preclude ongoing discussions between industry players and the DALRRD to address specifically identified constraints to innovations created by legislation. The inclusion of an impact assessment has also refined some of the issues that beset the regulatory system. The issue of long turnaround times, in my view, the system is continuously undergoing improvement, judging by the most recent development with the cannabis case study. Perhaps we should also commission a study around these aspects that could help us identify specific points at which delays are occurring in the process, and based on evidence, changes could be introduced as part of a reform process. I don't know, Wandile, you're looking at me, am I taking too much time?
No. Go ahead.
Okay.
I'm in agreement.
Can the system be improved? I think one of the things that can be improved is what I refer to as better evidence mechanisms. So what does this mean? I just referred to commissioning a study to determine where the backlogs are. So you then use the study to give you evidence so that you are targeted in terms of your law reform process. I think there's also opportunities in terms of how we as DALRRD employ risk analysis. So, risk management is the preserve of government. You can outsource risk communication. You can outsource assessment. But the determinant of the instrument to put in place resides with government. So, this can assist in alleviating a number of issues, but it's something that perhaps we should have a lengthy discussions about in terms of how that can land on the ground, and perhaps might require us to build confidence. Obviously, that is a necessity if this is to be achieved. I also think that as part of a bigger reform, if you think of Act 36, it's Act 36 of 1947. So there could be opportunity that in a broader reform process, we can have time-bound timelines in terms of when regulations can be reviewed. I think that can assist in ameliorating unintended consequences of legislation. We also struggle a little bit, and this is where now we as government tend to be at a disadvantage, that most publications that we put out in terms of regulations are responded to by people with interest. In some spaces, these are limited, and therefore there is a narrow participation. Is there opportunity to expand the regulatory process that it is inclusive and it incorporates the view of South Africans? Because every law that goes out in the end should have been and will impact the lives of South Africans. So those are my views in terms of how we can enhance the regulatory process to support innovation. I've already indicated that innovation is something that includes all of us, with the state as an enabler, but with yourselves also putting forward proposal in terms of areas that require legislation or amendment. I've also stated that there are certain aspects of legislation that reside with government, because that's the role of government. So with those few points, may I thank you for the opportunity. I hope you found the talk useful. But again, I'm going to impress on you that I think we must find some lasting solutions towards smallholder farmer developments. It's been 20-odd years that we're talking about this. I think we need to build more confidence so that we can use smarter ways of regulations by ensuring that we find each other and build stronger trust between government. I saw a number of points that in my view of the world are a little bit bizarre, that despite all these discussions that we are having, we fail to find each other in a meaningful way. I thank you.
Doc, thank you so very much for that. I'm going to ask you to take a seat. You cannot say those promising words and move away. I was actually looking at you because I was in agreement with the point you were making about evidence-based research as we're thinking about regulation and innovation. But thank you so very much from an Agbiz side for those remarks. We now have a good 30 minutes to ventilate some of those themes you have lifted, and we have a great panel that is in here that I've already introduced. And I want to begin perhaps maybe with you, Lukeshni, having listened to what Dr. Ntshabele has put forward on whether you really agree or you think there's an enhancement that can be made in the perception that he's painting, that the department is open for innovation. How are you seeing the mood of innovation, looking back maybe from the early 2000s up until now, sitting on the side of a SANSOR and some seed processor?
Thank you, Wandile. So I think he's absolutely right. South Africa has, since 1997, had legislature that introduced GMOs. We were the first country in Africa to have GMOs for our farmers, soybean, cotton, and maize. And we led on this for many years, and that just speaks to the fact that we were able to have a GMO Act in place that provided a very clear framework as to how technology providers could bring this technology in, allow farmers to have access and still maintain a fair balance for biodiversity concerns, etc. It took 15 years for the next African country to think about GMOs. It took a further 10 years before the third African country. So we have really been on the forefront of adopting, accepting, and implementing innovation when it has come to agriculture, specifically GMOs. And I represent the seed industry, so I'll just speak to that. He has mentioned new breeding techniques. We are unfortunately a little bit slower. We are now actually, perhaps, I don't even know if I can say last, but we've had Nigeria, Malawi, Kenya, all have introduced legislature and amended their policies to go for it. So we've had a history of positivity and excitement and energy, and it has since tapered down.
Thank you so much, Lukeshni, for those points. And I want to pull up one of the themes also that comes out of Dr. Ntshabele's presentation or speech. And for you, Rod, because Doc emphasizes the issue around smallholder inclusion as we develop technology. And I want you to reflect from an agrochemicals perspective as to whether you get the feeling that smallholder farmers are necessarily maybe left behind, and how would you then, if that's the case, think of the ways of making sure that they benefit on all of these technological developments that are good for the sector?
Thanks, Wandile. You'll remember at the Croplife SA Congress a few weeks back, we had a session with farmers. We had a wonderful dichotomy. We had a large-scale commercial grain farmer from the northwest, and we had a young lady, emerging farmer, who had just started her vegetable tunnel. And we used that primarily to go out to our members and say, we need to have a change. There is a pretty distinct value chain in getting products out to the large-scale commercial farmers, but the emerging commercial farmers or the small-scale commercial farmers, we do have a bit of a gap. So I'm not going to sit here one day and tell you it's not been it is being serviced. It is not. So we took that as the opportunity to really get our members thinking about how are we going to service small-scale growers. And innovation is certainly one of those areas, Wandile. And we've been discussing with Grain SA. We're going to have a pilot project with Grain SA where we want to start reaching out to all of these small-scale emerging farmers with some basic information. We're not going to be getting into recommending products. That's pretty much antitrust from our point of view with all of our members. But basic information. It's that time of the year. Are you scouting for fall armyworm? Are you scouting for tutor absoluta on your smallholder tomato fields? And linked to all of this, you'll remember it came out, Wandile, is the packaging. We have historically had packs in this country that are suitable for large-scale commercial farmers who are using 10 or 20-litre containers. Yet we know from our own members' operations in Southeast Asia or other parts of Africa, we do know that small packs are required for our emerging farmers, which again gives us opportunities to leapfrog, if I can use that expression. We don't have to do what we've always done with the large-scale farmers. We can bring in new innovations to make sure that as the plant protection supply industry, we are increasingly addressing the emerging small-scale farmers.
No, thanks so much, Rod. Before I move to you, Ms. Nompumelelo Mkhonza, I want to return back to Lukeshni, because one of the important things now, which all of the members in the Congress would agree with here, is that we have the climate change story, disrupting the way of production. Productivity is a big thing that we need to be driving out to deal with all of the hunger and issues that we face as nations. From your side as a private sector, sitting next to Ms. Mkhonza and Dr. Ntshabele, what are some of the new ways that your members are thinking about boosting productivity? And how should Dr. Ntshabele and Ms. Mkhonza be thinking about those technologies? Of course, sensitive to the matter that he mentioned that we shouldn't be touching on.
Well, let me just take it back to the fact that our job as private sector seed industry is to provide the right thing to the farmer to ensure his productivity and his profitability. It goes hand in hand. His job is to make sure he can produce a harvest at the end of the year so that the South African people and our nations around us can eat. In order for us to do that, we have to provide competitive genetics. We have to produce new varieties. It's our job to put varieties out on a year-to-year basis at the very least, so that every year the farmer has the opportunity to put a new variety into his farm. With that said, we bring with us certain knowledge on agronomic practices, how to do it better. We also have that background of research where it's not just the variety, but what supports the variety. We are pained by climate change. We are pained by the fact that there are so many people who are unable to have at least one nutritious meal. Food security and nutritional security go hand in hand. We have to just not, bulk up on just carbs. You have to have everything. It's vegetables as well. In addition to just having that direct access to the humans, we have to ensure that the animals are also fed. And I know I'm sitting here with a group of people who would much prefer to eat that than the vegetables, but it goes hand in hand into what also in our society we have to make sure that there are people who do not have refrigeration. You look at certain vegetables like butternut. We have to get those varieties out there, and that's where we stand. We're heavily burdened by functioning in a competitive environment and making sure we give a farmer what he needs, irrespective of who that farmer might be. And that relationship is lifelong and generational.
No, thank you. Thanks, Lukeshni, absolutely. And I must tell you, in the audience, there's a lot of vegetarians here. Vessel Lema, for example, from our office, he told me last night he changed. He's a vegetarian now. Let me come to you, Ms. Mkhonza. I want to get a sense as to whether Doc mentioned the two things here. He talked about the sentiments that needs to be considered of the consumer when one thinks about technology, GMO, and all of those things, as well as those that have vested interest or interest in the technology. And you were saying we need to be consulting widely when we think about regulations in general. But now I wanted to come back to the point, you are the registrar of the GMO Act, as to whether you see sentiment changing or the factors that you do consider as the registrar when you sit with some of these things are just broadly now compared and thinking back maybe in the early 2000s and 1999 to say, how is South Africa's perception into these technologies generally changing from your perspective where you sit?
Thank you, Wandile. I think the perception of South Africans since the early 2000s has actually improved when it comes to GMOs. We still have a number of groups that are not pro-GMOs, but as a regulator, our role is to make sure that we just implement the legislation and we try to strike a balance between the public and the technology holders. So as I've mentioned, the perception has really improved, although there are there's not a lot of studies that have been conducted. I'm aware of just 2 studies that were conducted by the Department of Science and Innovation just to check the perception of South Africans. And most of them are aware of what GMOs are, and they are aware that they have a choice of eating GMOs or not taking GMOs. So it's not as almost like adversarial as it was in the early 2000s. So it seems as if people are coming around with, to understand the technology better than they did in the previous years.
No, thanks so much, Ms. Mkhonza, on that. Doc, let me bring back to you the very same point you were raising. You closed with a point which you had started off with, where you were saying dualism is a problem. Smallholder farmers needs to be supported, and I think everyone in this audience wants to see the pie growing and the sector becoming more inclusive. And we all wish for that, as you saw in the points that were reflected by Dr. Kalaba. But from where you sit, what do you see then as a pathway to actually achieving that from the perspective of the discussion that we are having of technology developers in the sector?
Thanks for that point, Wandile. I think in many ways we are already en route. I pointed out in my presentation an example of a successful private-public partnership. So we are also in tandem doing the agro-processing master plan, which which you've discussed here. We should then be able to take lessons learned from existing partnerships so that we can short-circuit some of the implementation based on those lessons learned. And to my mind, that would assist all of us in ensuring that we become successful. I think one of the issues that perhaps we might not be discussing and not really be aware to is that we also have an aging farmer profile. And therefore, there's a benefit to the sector in ensuring that we become inclusive and bring young people on into the sector. Thank you.
No, thank you so very much, Dr. Ntshabele, for that. Perhaps maybe I could move to you, Rod, on this, because we are talking about the agrochemicals industry, which is so useful on driving the sector forward and listening to what Dr. Lukeshni and Ms. Mkhonza had said, but you also face other headwinds where in the EU, people say all kinds of things about the agrochemicals in the farm-to-fork strategy, particularly Green Deal. And I wonder how you are thinking about that from Croplife perspective, because your clients that are sitting in the audience here depend on that trade with the EU, just globally and in South Africa. How are you thinking about these things?
Thanks, Wandile. So The brief you gave us when we're talking about innovation and regulatory, a lot of people will jump onto regulatory and think it's just Act 36 in South Africa, the Fertilizer, Farm Feeds, Ag Remedies and Stock Remedies Act. However, we also have secondary regulators. So not only do our plant protection products need to be registered locally in South Africa, we also have to worry about the people who are importing the products. So those of you who sat in on the hot breakout session yesterday afternoon, you know the size of the exports of fresh produce from this country. You also know the importance it is in terms of US dollars. But the secondary regulators are things like organizations like Tesco's or Aldi, these European supermarkets that are putting more stringent requirements on residues in fresh produce, for example. So our local export farmers not only have to abide by local regulations, we also have to abide by international regulations. And as Wandile has alluded to, and we're all aware that the EU Green Deal and its subsection, the Farm to Fork, is certainly going to have a huge impact on our agriculture going forward. By 2030, they want to reduce the use of pesticides by 30%, which is significant. They want to increase the hectareage put to organic agriculture from 8 to 25%, which is also significant. But the part of the EU Green Deal and the Farm to Fork that is going to impact us in South Africa or our producers is the so-called mirror clauses. And those mirror clauses say that if a European farmer is exposed to these restrictions, so should the farmers in the countries where the imported produce is originating. So that is going to be a big impact. I must say, when the French presidency was pushing us through, presidency of the European Union at that stage, they did recognize that the mirror clauses should contain the option for some form of exemptions. And certainly this is where we're going to be looking to our colleagues in DTI, our colleagues in Croplife International, Croplife Africa Middle East, where we interact with Brussels, is to push for some of those exemptions. Making a decision in Europe to say that we will no longer accept produce coming in that has been produced with an active ingredient or a pesticide not registered in Europe is just not going to fly. Don't have subtropical fruits grown in Europe. So how can they say that? We have pests in Africa that they don't have in Europe. So we will have crop pest combinations that they don't have in Europe. So they cannot have a blanket ban on certain active ingredients. But we can't do that on our own, Wandile. Yes, we will be fighting, but we will certainly need regulators internationally, but locally, and also partners such as DTI to help us fight for those exemptions so that our local producers of export produce can still be using products that are no longer authorized or registered in the European Union, as an example. Just an example for you where headwinds that our industry is going to face going forward from the regulatory side of plant protection solutions.
No, thank you so much, Rod, for those points. A lot of issues, domestic and international regulation. And fortunately, the good doctor here talked about domestically, we can even make time bounds so that we can make these updates or amendments in our regulations perhaps even more agile. And I wonder, Doc, what sort of time bounds were you having in mind as to whether you think that's something that in the department in general, not committing yourself, will be open to such regular reviews of some of these things?
Wandile, I don't have a specific timeline. I am acknowledging that there's a time span. We have an old piece of legislation from 1947. Perhaps there's an opportunity to think along the lines of, so if you think of anything that you do, there's always a time span that you put to something. So we must look at evidence. So you and I cannot say that we like the idea of evidence-based decision-making and then sit here and say, no, we are going to say 20 years. So I think it would be best to look at evidence globally, case studies of other countries. For instance, in the EU, they have what they refer to as a better regulation system, which includes timelines where legislation that's been enacted gets reviewed. I think they have a 10-year period. Yes. So the benefit is really dealing with unintended consequences based on experience on how that legislation has been implemented. So it's something that from a broader point of view of regulatory reform, we should look at and explore in terms of how best it can assist us as South Africa. Of course, mindful that we are in a bit of a disadvantage. I mean, the EU is made of 27 times 27, where they are able to distribute the work between the different member states. So we must be mindful. But I'm also accepting that we have an act that's from 1947, and I'm sure we can really do better in terms of ensuring that it is improved and brought to current requirements in the marketplace.
No, I'm raising it intentionally, actually, Doc, because if you look right at the back by that red light, you will see Mr. Divet Boshoff. He chairs the Inputs Forum, which has been working closer with the department on some of these things. But the other thing that you do acknowledge when you speak with many people that are here in the audience, the issue of Act 36 comes up almost every farmers meeting. And I think we've been having that discussion for over 5 years. We really do need to make whatever necessary amendments that will push us all as a country forward in updating some of these things. That's a comment. And I want to move to you, Ms. Mkhonza, to just reflect briefly on the productivity of having adopted some of these technologies. That if you think about in grains, in oil seeds, having adopted some of these GMO technologies, and you're looking back, I think you would attest that our yields and the productivity to an extent, of course, there's a number of things that have contributed to that, but mainly that technology have assisted us as a country to move forward. If you could reflect on that and the appreciation of it when you think forward now about some of the new technologies, as to whether that will be a nudge for you to be more open.
It's a bit difficult to talk about productivity, especially when I'm in the regulatory space, because the act that we're dealing with is not only focusing on the productivity. But as I indicated previously, we have a basket of legislations that any user is free to choose from. And yes, productivity has increased because of GMOs, but I'm unable to sit here and sound like I'm advocating for GMOs as a regulator. So as I mentioned earlier, it's just a bit difficult to talk about the productivity, although there are numbers and we see it has increased, it has been adopted, and possibly it could help for other technologies to be adopted in a similar way. But as a regulator, it's just a bit tricky to come and talk about the productivity of GMOs.
No, thank you so much. Well taken on that, because I think the growth in general, and it's just a comment for me as moderator, that we have experienced as South Africa's agriculture. We have a sector that has more than doubled in volume and value terms from 1994 up until today. And where we sit at Agbiz, when we look at the numbers, there's clear evidence that the technological adoption has been at the heart of that progress with the opening up of trade. And you as a department, of course, you've been in charge of some of the regulations. And I think the energy that we had at the start of this, it's something that could help us propel if we can still have some robust energy there. And Lukeshni, that brings me to you. Doc talked about the PPPs that are important between the government as well as the private sector. And I wonder if the current relationships that we are having, which are good because we are able to sit down on the table, they can be improved. And how can you see us even working much more closer together as South Africa Inc. when we think about technologies and progress?
Wandile, absolutely. I think SANSOR is a great example of public-private partnership for the last 30-odd years in terms of seed certification. I think what is key is that we continue to leverage off existing relationships. None of us can do it alone. None of us in this room can do it alone. I can't produce seed if I don't have farmers acting in an enabling environment. We need the government. The government needs us. We need the agro processors. We're in it together and we're in it to win it. We have a responsibility to the people of the country to provide the best that we can. From SANSOR's side, we are ever willing to work with the department. It has been a great part of our relationship for the last 10 years. I think even my predecessors will speak to that. And we've had a good relationship regarding this. And it goes beyond innovations, actually. It speaks to everything. And that is the only way we're going to win as a country, is through public-private partnerships.
No,
And that's the theme of what we've been saying for the last day and a half.
No, absolutely. Thanks, Lukeshni. Rod, I could even pose the same question to you.
Wandile, absolutely. So through both SAFE and our own associations, we have been engaging with DALRRD. For sure, public-private partnerships are the way to go. Our only concern at the moment is things are moving slowly. This big administrative tank that is the European Union is moving ahead. It's moving ahead quite fast with the Green Deal. And we are going to have products disappearing from the market, which means our local producers are not going to have the latest innovations and the latest technologies to remain competitive. We already heard in the Hort breakout yesterday that we are not competitive due to tariffs. If we start being non-competitive because our produce will not be accepted because it's been grown with obsolete technology, we've just lost competitiveness. The current backlog of about 3 years for a new product to be registered doesn't take into account the 3 or 4 years previous to that to test the new molecules. So yes, we welcome the engagement with DALRRD. We would absolutely want to get into a PPP tomorrow, but things need to gain a little bit of acceleration. We're going to end up very soon where our export farmers will not be competitive because we're using old technology that is not accepted. So in this case, regulations are slowing down innovation coming into our market. We have members who are not bringing new technologies to South Africa. They say your regulatory process is not predictable, it's not measurable, we don't know how long it's going to take, so why should we bother? Let's take our new technologies to other countries. So more than willing to engage. We're desperate for a PPP to get the regulatory process revamped. We're not ducking regulations. Regulations are essential to protect the environments, the consumers in terms of the food, the workers and the operators using the products. We're not ducking regulation. We just need a predictable and timeous regulatory process. So we're here to engage and to get that moving along as fast as we can.
No, thanks so much, Rod. Before I close off with Doc, let me just get a last word from you, Ms. Mkhonza, and just ask, Doc mentioned that regulations should not be all of those the vested interests. So how are you thinking, just generally, as a registrar, about how you're going to involve other partners? Because I guess those that are having a vested interest, one cannot even define it as a vested interest per se, but rather that they have an incentive to be there. A consumer, it's not like they don't have an incentive, but they have an indirect interaction with food through the retailer rather than from a production. But how do you plan to bring them on so that your consultations are robust?
Thanks, Wandile. As Dr. Ntshabele has already indicated, the whole space is for us all, right? It should not be seen as just a government issue to deal with regulations. He also indicated that there's a place for industry to say, we need these regulations to be transformed in this manner. So it doesn't have to be just a government issue. So we can all work together, and I mean, there's always room for improvement. Currently, the consultations that we have, I'm sure we can all agree that, there's room for improvement, so they do need to improve. It's just that sitting here right now, I cannot indicate, ABC, this is what really needs to happen. We can still sit around and have a discussion as all stakeholders to see how things can improve.
No, absolutely, and with great appreciation, because each matter differ and it will have to be approached differently on that. And I will close off with you, Doc. You're listening to Rod, you're listening to Lukeshni about how we should all be even strengthening the partnerships that are already happening, but also some of the difficulties and constraints in your department on capacity-wise, perhaps, and many regulatory stuff that might be stumbling innovation or adoption of innovation. Broadly thinking, what do you have in mind so that you are more agile and...
Thanks, Wandile. I think in many ways I have anticipated that question because I have spoken to how we can improve or reform the regulatory process. I spoke to risk analysis and how some aspects of risk analysis can be performed elsewhere. And I have said that risk management is the precise preserve of government. That cannot be outsourced. However, risk communication can be, it's communication about the risks that are experienced with a product or something. That can be done by a communications company. The assessment process can be done by scientists who can then present their report So I was actually provoking industry to go back and reflect, but I've even given you a caveat, that the caveat would be on building strong relationships based on trust. That
Yes.
you are not going to appoint a group of scientists who you know that are going to be leaning in a certain way. So
Yes.
in many ways, that could be a framework of lessening the burden on the state side, but even advantaging industry in terms of how we can expedite and then have timeous procedures in terms of approvals or registrations.
All right. Now, Doc, you've enriched our insight. We know that you were put in this session on the last minute as the minister had to travel to Europe. So we are grateful to you about that. And my colleague, Theo Boshoff, has something to thank you that is sponsored by our friends from ABSA. And for you, Ms. Mkhonza, Rod, and Lukeshni, we have something also sponsored by our friends at Vinpro. And thank you so very much for your time and insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Make away this sign.
Thank you. I hope it was useful. Thank you.
Theo has a short announcement, and then right after Theo's announcement, we're going to have a word of concluding the session from our chairman, Mr. Francois Stradom, and thereafter, the chairman will also direct you to a place for a lunch, and the Agbiz members will remain behind for the AGM. And then we will meet you shortly, all of the non-Agbiz members, for food in that side. So Theo, this is over to you and Chairman Stradom.
Thank you very much, Wandile. Colleagues, my announcement, just a bit of housekeeping and so on, to ensure that our AGM runs smoothly. We just want to ensure that everyone who was nominated to vote on behalf of their companies or received a proxy to vote will be able to do so. So we set up a dummy vote that you can just double check. So colleagues, I have the instructions here just from the tech persons. So again, once again, there's only one person that will be voting per company or per organization that's a member, and then it's obviously weighted appropriately. So if you are the person who's entitled to vote, I ask you to please log out of the app, and then you log in with the same details. So it's the same username, the same PIN, but it will now be AGM 2022, not Agbiz 2022. So you just need to log out, and with the event, select AGM 2022. Use your same PIN, your same username, which again was emailed to you in case anyone forgot it. And then if you look at these round sort of buttons on the landing page, there's one for voting. If you access that, you should be able to see a dummy vote, which simply asks, can you see this? Can you see this vote? If you can see this, then everything will run smoothly. If you are supposed to be voting and you cannot see that, however, then we ask that you just, after the chairman's closing, whilst the guests leave, quickly come speak to our tech persons and Natasha and the auditor at the back, so we can just ensure that we make sure everything's fine on the app. So just quickly to repeat that, you log out, you select AGM 2022, and then you log in with your same details, a PIN which was emailed again, and then under voting you should see the dummy vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Theo. We are very close to the ending. I will not try to summarize. I think you've had access to excellent information and you've made up your own mind. But I would rather try to summarize the mood that I've picked up from our delegates and from our members in 3 simple ways. And the first is the power of individual responsibility and ownership. That is where it starts. Theo this morning referred to Theodore Roosevelt's speech, The Man in the Middle. Just to remind you, that was done in April 1910 at the Sorbonne University, at that time the leading university in Paris. And it was the American president who went there and spoke about the power of individual responsibility. He was really messaging and encouraging his own people back home in the US, and that was just before the First World War that started in 1914, the power of individual responsibility. Secondly, the power of that individual responsibility knitted together in a team. Now, the most simple way is almost the oversimplification that Rassie Erasmus used at the previous World Cup. To take individual skills, knit it into a team, and a team who nobody expected to do anything, ultimately won that World Cup and really kicked the British asses. So that is the power of individuals knitted into a team. The third thing is your plan, and that is the basis of our organization, of Agbiz. A well-researched plan that makes a statement and gives an input. It is very easy to sit on the side and give an unresearched opinion. It takes you nowhere. So it is important to, when you say, do it on an evidence-based basis and make an input and then stand. I think all of us are sick and tired of promises and of shenanigans. We want execution, and that is the mantra of Agbiz. So these 3 aspects, really, in a nutshell, is the Agbiz mantra. We have an unbelievable sector and a whole value chain. I try to emphasize that. It's not individuals. It is from the farmer, the primary producer, right through to serve the ultimate client. That is a value chain. We can never deny each other. We should always keep that in mind. Human capital is what unlocks that. Human capital and attitude, those 2 things, gives execution and performance. So my congratulations to our Agbiz team. You have outperformed yourself. I'd really like us to give them a round of applause. It's a young, enthusiastic team that has worked around the clock. You've outdone yourself. Well done. Please travel safely back home. Our farmers are in the midst of collecting yet another harvest, and it's not easy. Conditions aren't the best that they should be, so we wish you luck. We wish all our businesses luck. You really do us proud with the way that you perform. So travel safely, and God bless, and with that, I officially close Agbiz 2022 conference. Thank you.